Our loving God in heaven, we've been brought again through another week to worship together at your feet. We thank you for each other. We thank you for the movement and the messages that have given us hope and understanding of the world that we're living in. And we just seek more of your truth. And we ask that you would bless us and all that we hold dear. We pray that we would know enough to be an influence for the good for others. So we think of our members in Fiji as well, and just thank you that that we can have an understanding of current events. We do pray that we will understand them as you do. So we ask for your Holy Spirit, and we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I thought today we might, instead of just walking across the date line, our line, we might trace one thing in particular across our line. And I thought we could work through Taiwan. So Taiwan is I found it a very interesting and enlightening subject. So I'm going to just bring up the whiteboard that we had been using. And there's a few things I've got to add to it, but I'll get around to that. So we marked Taiwan in the beginning in 1949. Mao Zedong's communists take power in Beijing. They defeat the Nationalist Party in a civil war. And the KMT, the Nationalist Party, flee to Taiwan and set up their own government in Taipei. They cut off all contact with mainland China. And in 1950, Taiwan becomes an ally of the United States. We didn't talk about that, but 1950 begins the Korean War. And so it's really a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Russia is backing North Korea, America backs South Korea, and China gets involved when the South start taking back territory in the North with the idea of actually wiping communism out of Korea. And China is very nervous about that and steps in. And so America backs off and they eventually come to an armistice, which is really what we've got today. It's not a peace, it's just an armistice. And we have North and South Korea. So Taiwan does become an ally. America relies on Taiwan during the Korean War. So that's immediately after 1949. Then we marked Taiwan again in 1979, when mainland China, the CCP, enter into, United States recognizes them as the legitimate government of China and agrees to a one China policy. And even though that cuts out Taiwan, Congress enacts the Taiwan Relations Act to ensure that it would be there to protect it. And this is where we mark China's economic reforms taking off. But we could also mark Taiwan as starting to engage in the international community, and its economy is going to take off as well. So between the mid-1980s and 2016, there's a fragile reconciliation between Taiwan and China. So the Taiwan government, because of the economy, because of its need for trade with China, they start getting friendlier. And that's going to last until 2016. But again, 1989, Tiananmen Square is going to sort of, I guess, mess up that relationship, because it makes Taiwan very nervous that the Chinese government would turn on its own people and use military force to destroy the democratic protests that were going on in Tiananmen Square. So what the Taiwanese government did is they immediately contacted the United States, as did other countries in the world, and asked them to put sanctions, to condemn China, and then it backed off really quickly. So sanctions were put on China, but Taiwan joined about 35 other Asian countries in not declaring anything else on China. They just backed off, and the reasons for that was the increasing trade links that all of these countries in East Asia were having with China, that they relied on them, and they didn't want to upset China too much. So a lot of East Asia didn't join in the condemnation of China and the sanctions. Even though Taiwan did it first, it backed off. So 1989 is where we mark our information war. And we can see that with China, with the introduction of the endless purge, of purging out the Tiananmen Square protests out of the consciousness of its people. So one of the things that China did in 1989 was blame Taiwan for the protests. So, because everything is always somebody else's interference. They don't look at themselves, it's somebody else interfering in their country. So the blame initially was put on Taiwan. So that was the disinformation coming out in 1989. So we can mark Taiwan there in 1989. So in 1991, we see that the state of war ends with Taiwan. Taiwan lifts its emergency rule, unilaterally ending a state of war. And now the first direct talks between the two sides are held in Singapore a couple of years later. We marked 1996 and the third Taiwan Strait crisis. That was the year of their first fully democratic elections in Taiwan. And China wanted to interfere and put fear into the people about voting in a democratic government. It didn't work because America got involved, and we saw a democratic government elected. China tests missiles off Taiwan to deter voters in the island's first democratic presidential elections. Now, if we come down to the next elections, which was the year 2000, the KMT, which is that nationalist, the original party of Taiwan, it loses power for the first time. And as a result of that, trade links improve between China and Taiwan. So now their economies are getting more and more connected. But then 2001, World Trade Center, September 11 attacks. And now the Chinese government is going to start labeling their ethnic minorities in the Northwest as terrorists. And it's going to use the September 11 attacks as precedent for that. Labeling violence in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region as terrorism. So America will start its war on terrorism from 2001. China starts planning its war on terrorism from 2001. We see that in they were actually working on that prior to that. They had this document that in document 7 in 1996, where they were planning to be more controlling over those regions, but they were able to use September 11 as their excuse to really bring that into practice. So it starts planning its war on terrorism. And in 2014, there's 2 acts that the Chinese government are going to bring in. First of all, it's Strike Hard Against Violent Terrorism initiative, Strike Hard Against Violent Terrorism. And that's when they will start, under Xi Jinping, really clamping down on the Uyghur minorities and all the Islamic minorities. The other one that it's going to bring in, and it's not on the, I'll put these two on a refreshed board, is the Made in China policy. It's called the Made in China 2025. 2014, China realizes it's got a problem. It's falling behind in the manufacturing of advanced semiconductors. So it introduces this policy, Made in China 2025, where it wants to build more factories to build their own semiconductors and to become more self-reliant. So two major steps that the Chinese government will do in 2014. They also, in 2014, hold the first government-to-government talks since separation. So 2014, we marked Taiwan again, where they have had some contact. They met in Singapore, but this is first face-to-face government-to-government PRC and RIC talks in 2014. Then we're going to come down to 2016. Now, 2016, we have another election. And we have the election of Tsai Ing-wen. Tsai Ing-wen was the leader of the pro-independent Democratic Progressive Party. And I'll just introduce you to her. This is Tsai Ing-wen. First female leader in Taiwan, but also progressive independent party. What Tsai Ing-wen represents is the first generation that is born in Taiwan, that see themselves as Taiwanese, not Chinese. And there is a stronger and stronger push for independence. There was a lot of Chinese interference in these elections as well. And Tsai Ing-wen is still in government. She's held her 2 terms. She cannot stand for re-election next year in 2024. So next year is going to be a very interesting year for Taiwan. We won't talk about that today. So Tsai Ing-wen, now the new president of Taiwan, and the honeymoon period is over for the relationship between China and Taiwan. In her victory speech, Tsai said the results showed that democracy is ingrained in the Taiwanese people and that she will strive to maintain stability with China. She said, "We will work towards maintaining the status quo for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait in order to bring the greatest benefits and well-being to the Taiwanese people. The day of her inauguration in May, China cautions that peace would be impossible if she makes any moves to formally break away." And in June, China suspended all communications with Taiwan after the island's new government failed to acknowledge the concept that there is only one China. You might remember the 2016 election with President Trump. One of the first things he did as president-elect was ring Tsai directly when she won that election, and it broke protocol. It was it really made the news that he had broken decades of US diplomatic policy by ringing her directly when she won that election, because it was Taiwan. And America had said that they formally recognized China as one China and mainland China as one China. So it did not go over well with the Chinese government. In 2017, Trump's administration approves a $1.4 billion worth of arms sales to Taiwan. This also angered Beijing. And then in March 2018, the US adopted a law reinforcing ties with Taiwan, again, infuriating China. In 2018, the US State Department approved the sale to Taiwan of spare parts for F-16 fighter jets and other military aircraft worth up to $330 million, drawing a warning from China that the move jeopardized cooperation between Beijing and Washington. So things have been developing since this new Progressive Democratic Party and the election of Tsai Ing-wen. And we see more and more backing from the US for Taiwan. We come down to 2021. And Xi Jinping gives a speech. Xi Jinping vows to fulfill Taiwan reunification with China by peaceful means. So this is an article in October. In July of 2021, he said he was going to smash any attempts for Taiwanese independence. By October, he kind of toned it down a little, but he's still pledging to reunify. So it's been a year of Xi Jinping really reinforcing to the world that China is bent on reuniting Taiwan with China. Let's see, he says, Taiwan's independence separatism is the biggest obstacle to achieving the reunification of the motherland and the most serious hidden danger to national rejuvenation. He said the day before the anniversary of the revolution that overthrew China's last imperial dynasty in 1911. So that's part of his speech. So it was a week of heightened tensions, lots of shooting of missiles across the strait, just for practice, of course. And yeah, a lot of chest beating. So that's 2021. And China has not deviated from its idea of reunification with Taiwan, whom they see as dangerous separatists. So why is Taiwan such a big deal? Why is it always in the news? Why does America care? We need to go back to 2014. China has always wanted to reunify Taiwan, but there's something else at play here at the moment. So I'm just going to go to Google Maps. We'll take a fresh look at China. So here's a map. You can see the outline of China here. Xinjiang province up here in the northwest, Tibet, Beijing up here, and here's Taiwan. Taiwan is about half the size of Tasmania, probably 3 times the size of Viti-Levu, and it's 160 kilometers off mainland China. So that's like Geelong to Seymour or Sydney to Newcastle. It's not far. And this is where the original Chinese government fled at the end of the revolution, the Civil War. And to understand the importance of Taiwan today, we need to scroll out a bit further. And we're going to go across the North Pacific over to the United States and over here to San Francisco. And what do we call this area here? The southern San Francisco Bay Area of California. This area, if I just scroll out a little more, this area around Stanford University, Palo Alto, is Silicon Valley. And one of the reasons that Taiwan is so significant today in world economy and politics is that the largest silicon chip facility in the world, as Ian Bremmer put it, the most strategically important company in the whole world is on that island of Taiwan. And it is called the ASMC. No, that's ASML. Sorry, it's called the TSMC, Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. It manufactures silicon chips. So over here in America is Silicon Valley. Now, that's it's just a nickname. There is no Silicon Valley. It doesn't exist, literally. But it's this area of southern San Francisco in Palo Alto where the technology began, centered around Stanford University, that developed the first semiconductors, silicon chips. So first of all, what's a silicon chip? So a chip is a piece of silicon with a lot of tiny circuits carved into it. These circuits are either completed or interrupted via a device called a transistor, which is a switch. Basically turns things on and off. When a circuit is on, it produces a 1. When a circuit is off, it produces a 0. And all those 1s and 0s that undergird all of software, all of data storage, it's just circuits turning on or off to produce the right digit. So the first silicon chips were developed here in San Jose. And it was by a man called Robert Noyce in 1959. And he fabricated the first silicon chip out of silicon, the first semiconductor. So if we say semiconductors, silicon chips, integrated circuits, microchips, they're all basically the same thing. You could argue semantics, but we're talking about the same thing. So that very, very first chip had 4 transistors on it, 4 on and off switches. Today, a brand new iPhone would have a dozen chips in it, and one of those chips would have between 11 and 18 billion transistors on and off switches on it. The technology that has developed since 1959 with these chips has increased exponentially. It's got a name. It's called Moore's Law. So there was one of the earlier engineers involved with the making of this chip was a man called Gordon Moore. So he was one of the founders of the original company that made the chip, and he went on to found Intel. So it was about 7 years after the first chip that had 4 transistors on it. In a couple of years, there was 12 transistors on it. In a couple of more years' time, there was 100 transistors on it. And he came up with the theory. He noticed that in round about every 2-year period, the amount of transistors was doubling. And that's what's called Moore's law. So from 4 up to 18 billion that you can fit on one of the most advanced silicon chips today. With the advancement of the chip also comes the advancement of the technology that makes the chip. So if you look in this area, this is where you're going to see companies like Apple, Meta, which is Facebook, Alphabet, Google, Adobe, Cisco, eBay, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, LinkedIn, NVIDIA, PayPal, Zoom. They're all in this area here. But when these companies started, right back in the early days, they would design their chips and they would make their chips. And there was companies in America that could make the chips. But as the chips got more advanced, so did the need for more advanced personnel and equipment to make them. So it's one thing to design them, then you've got to make them. So America started looking around for cheap labor. They even tried making it on Indian reservations because they thought we could get cheap labor there. But in the end, they couldn't compete with Hong Kong. So the first semiconductors started to be made in factories in Hong Kong, where the cheapest labor was. And then it kind of spread over East Asia. There was a man, his name is Morris Chang. Morris Chang was born in mainland China, but he was educated in Hong Kong. His family moved to Hong Kong. Then he came to America. He went through Harvard, MIT, and he started working for Texas Instruments. You might be familiar with Texas Instruments if you're like me and you're ancient. It was one of the first calculators we were given were Texas Instrument calculators. And I remember working in the laboratory, and all our scales, etc., were Texas Instruments. But it's a worldwide known company. So he was working for them, and he worked for them high up for decades. And after about 30 years, he actually got looked over for the CEO position. And he thought, oh, I'm going to go. So what happened was the Taiwanese government poached him. And they said, come over to us, because we're building semiconductor factories, and we've got them, but we want to go higher up on the value chain. So what Morris Chang did was he created this brilliant business model in Taiwan where he said, we'll just make them. Let all those other companies out there design them, send us their plans, and all we'll do is manufacture them. And they built the most highly advanced manufacturing fabs. That's what they're called, these buildings that build these chips. They're called fabs. So they were all built in Taiwan. So 2023, and the most important, strategically important, most advanced, complex factories in the world are in Taiwan. It's a huge concern. And it's a huge concern that touches every economy in the world. So the simple creed for semiconductors is smaller, faster, cheaper. And that's what the modern world runs on semiconductors. It's what's made the modern world. You'll hear people say that data is the new oil, but you can't have data without semiconductors. There's nothing else in the economy that has experienced exponential growth than these semiconductor factories. So a little bit more about semiconductors. Well, you can look that up in your own time. It's fascinating technology. But I guess a semiconductor is what the name says. You have like copper, which is a really good conductor, and you have glass, which is a bad conductor. Silicon is a semiconductor. You can turn it on and off. But they combine it with other metals. They combine it with tin and all sorts of different metals today. Now, if we went back into the 1950s, the first semiconductors were created just for the Pentagon, just for the defense system. So America's defense system wanted guided missiles. You've seen pictures of computers back decades ago where they filled whole rooms. What they wanted was to put a computer on the end of a cone of a missile. And not just that, but also be able to guide it. They needed smaller computers. So that's where the idea of this original chip came from. Never had any idea that it would end up with commercial use. But as it started, these companies started making a lot of money just making things for the defense, the American defense system. Then they realized that there was another market in like corporate world, providing computers for the corporate world. And then, of course, it's just grown where we've all got computers in our pockets, on our phones. But Gordon Moore actually he foresaw the day when we would have phones in our pockets.
Terrie, can I?
Yes.
Is that mean that whoever controlled Taiwan controlled the economy of the world?
So what they say is, if you can control the data, you can control the world.
Well, yes.
So the power is in data. So we'll get to that. It's just not as easy. So the complexity of these factories, China couldn't just walk in and take over. It's just not that easy. But it would certainly disrupt the whole economy. Anything that shut down those factories, if there was war declared and the factories got shut down, it would affect the whole world within days because it would disrupt supply chains. It would look what COVID did in 2020. The reason why people are still waiting on new cars in Australia, semiconductors. The supply chains got messed up. So we'll talk more about China and the possibility of it invading Taiwan.
Probably Elon Musk. For Tesla, you need that a lot.
The company that has the greatest contract with TSMC is Apple. So I'd say that Tim Cook is one of the most powerful men in the world. So you're not far wrong. That if you had one of those multinational tech industries, you have a lot of power. The reason why these tech industries grew so big is because of how semiconductors were able to be advanced so quickly, but also because of lack of regulation. So there's a lot of things at play here. So China relies on these as well. They spend more money importing chips every year than they do oil. So TSMC, this Taiwanese silicon chip manufacturing company, it produces 90% of all the world's most advanced chips. So they're the chips that go for military use and for high-end use. So 90% come out of Taiwan. It's about 30-odd% of the world's chips in total. Others come from South Korea. You've got Samsung in South Korea. There's some in America and Intel, but Intel are actually a couple of generations behind in the technology. Samsung are a little behind too. China makes, there's countries that make their own chips, but not the advanced chips that Taiwan make.
Elder Terrie,
So China's,
sorry.
yes, Ray?
Was it, I think it was in the article that we read on the risks that these factories need to have real-time connection to the outside world and not just like the United States or China. There's other places in the world that need to have a constant internet connection to those factories to support that manufacturing process. Is that part of why all of this would fall down straight away if there was, you know, an invasion or something like that?
It's so global, yes. So you think this most really advanced factory in Taiwan that is dependent on gases from Japan, you know, materials from South Korea. The machine that makes the lithography machine, and all it does is that uses light as a laser to etch onto the silicon. There's only one company in the world that makes that, and that's in the Netherlands. So if I say Philips, you all know for Philips, you've gone into the Good Guys or Harvey Norman and seen Philips irons, etc. Philips is a huge tech company, a Dutch company, but it had a spin-off called ASML, and it's now an independent company, but it builds the lithography machines that laser in the patterns, the circuit patterns onto the silicon. Doesn't make the chip, it just lasers that in. They're $150 million a pop. To transport them takes 4 Boeing 747s, heaps of trucks and shipping containers, and the personnel that make them fly with them and often work with them for the life of the machine. Incredibly complex, incredibly accurate. This laser can hit a golf ball on the moon. The machines that make the mirrors that go into these lithography machines are the flattest mirrors ever made. And the components to make that machine come from all over the world. You're talking about hugely complex supply chains. And it all ends up on this little island that's 160 kilometers off mainland China. So it wasn't a lot of forethought, but it was incredibly efficient, because now you've got all those companies in Silicon Valley. They don't have to think about making the chips. They just buy off the shelf from Taiwan. So Taiwan has makes 100% of Apple's silicon chips, and and the rest. So it's incredibly complex. Tim Cook, the CEO of Google, before he became CEO, before he became top dog, he was in charge of supply chains. They are incredibly complex systems that are global. And we got a taste of what happens when these supply chains break down when we had COVID.
Yeah, I was thinking of parallels with Europe and Russia too. Everyone was, all of Europe was reliant on Russia for energy, and then they had to find somewhere else. But with Taiwan, there's kind of no other option if that goes.
OPEC has 40% of the oil, right?
Yeah.
That's nothing compared.
Not compared to this.
No, 90%, over 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Few other notes, more than a quarter. Josephine?
Yeah. Years ago, I heard this. Americans make the first model, and then the Asians copy and enlarge or make better ones. Now, listening to you, it sort of, I don't know how true what I've just said, but it sort of expanded my mind as to how enormous, what is happening in Taiwan with all that technology and the chips and
yeah, it's a global economy. Say something. Made me think of something and I've forgotten. So I might come back to it. So I've got this book. It's called Chip War. It was written in 2022. It's the Business Book of the Year 2022 winner, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology by Chris Miller. And I just want to read a little bit from the introduction. And I might think about where it's going. He says, the rivalry between the United States and China may well be determined by computing power. Strategists in Beijing and Washington now realize that all advanced tech, from machine learning to missile systems, from automated vehicles to armed drones, requires cutting-edge chips, known more formally as semiconductors or integrated circuits. A tiny number of companies control their production. We rarely think about chips, yet they've created the modern world. And it goes on to talk about the ones and the zeros, which we've already talked about. Around a quarter of the chip industry's revenue comes from phones. Much of the price of a new phone pays for the semiconductors inside. For the past decade, each generation of iPhone has been powered by one of the world's most advanced processor chips. In total, it takes over a dozen semiconductors to make a smartphone work, with different chips managing the battery, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, cellular network connections, audio, the camera, and more. Apple makes precisely none of these chips. It buys most of them off the shelf. Fabricating and miniaturizing semiconductors has been the greatest engineering challenge of our time. Today, no firm fabricates chips with more precision than Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, better known as TSMC. In 2020, as the world lurched between lockdowns driven by a virus whose diameter measured around 100 nanometers, billionths of a meter, TSMC's most advanced facility, Fab 18, was carving microscopic mazes of tiny transistors, etching shapes smaller than half the size of a coronavirus, 1/100th the size of a mitochondria. TSMC replicated this process at a scale previously unparalleled in human history. Apple sold over 100 million iPhone 12s, each powered by an A14 processor chip with 11.8 billion tiny transistors carved into its silicon. In a matter of months, in other words, for just one of those dozen chips in an iPhone, TSMC's Fab 18 fabricated well over 1 quintillion transistors. That is a number with 18 zeros behind it. Last year, the chip industry produced more transistors than the combined quantity of all goods produced by all other companies in all other industries in all human history. Nothing else comes close. So it just gives you an idea of the scale of this. We don't stop and think about chips. They're in everything. They're in your washing machine. They're in your jug. They're in basically the most simplest of light switches is the only thing that wouldn't have them. They're just in everything.
Imagine the amount of chips that they use for the AI.
Yes. And that's what America does not want China to develop. AI is all about data. Can't have data without semiconductors. if any one of the steps in the semiconductor production process is interrupted, the world's supply of new computing power is imperiled. In the age of AI, it is often said that data is the new oil, yet the real limitation we face isn't the availability of data, but of processing power. And then it talks, so what has been created in Taiwan is a masterful piece of efficiency, but it's also very vulnerable. I mean, not just China, but it's sitting on a fault line. I don't know. You know, they don't build these factories near roads, near highways or airports because you can't have vibrations. So you build it on top of a fault line. But anyway, but he goes on to say, yet the seismic shift that most imperils semiconductor supply today isn't the crash of tectonic plates, but the clash of great powers, and that's China and the US. So a very interesting book, Chip War, and it goes through the history of the chips, and it's ends in Taiwan. So okay, so let's talk about Russia and the Ukraine war. So when the war started and Russia made gains into Ukraine, and then Ukraine starts pushing back, what the Ukrainians noticed is, well, they noticed all the looting. So looting comes with any war, but the Russians were taking washing machines. And they're like, why are they taking the washing machines? Haven't they got washing machines? They're taking anything that had chips in it. So since the war and the sanctions, Russia has lost its, not being able to import any advanced chips. So it has certain capacities to make some chips, but nothing that it imports, just like China, it imports a lot of chips. Now I remember what I was going to say, Josephine. So, you know, when you buy things and it says made in China, really, it's put together in China. So the chips are all made, most of those chips are made offshore, not all of them. They have capacity to make some of them. But even the components that make the made in China stuff comes in from other countries, is sourced elsewhere. So that was the point, sorry, Josephine, I was going to make.
Thank you.
But with Russia, there's no country that's self-sufficient. So the reason Russia has struggled so badly in its effort to invade Ukraine is that they're using a lot of really rudimentary military technology, old Soviet technology, and they're nowhere up to date with advanced technology and the semiconductors. So when we talked about the information war being won at the beginning of the Ukraine war because America were able to control the narrative, how did they control that narrative? Because of all the information they gained through the technology that Russia doesn't have. So if you think of a cell phone tower, it's just a tower with a heap of semiconductors at the top of it. You know, all the information that comes back is because of this high-tech equipment. Russia doesn't have access to that and is not able to build on it. The only way they can get semiconductors now is pirated versions, and then they can't be trusted. So what the Ukrainians were noticed was a lot of their missiles, they're not guided missiles. They don't have the accuracy. And then it's not just chips that are needed on the cones of these things, that you need them at every step, at all the equipment that goes into relaying information. They have no modern smart weapons. But what's being given to Ukraine is high-end technology. So, how much time?
So this really makes Taiwan very vulnerable.
It's vulnerable and it's essential.
Oh.
The whole world is vulnerable because of Taiwan. So what does the American government going to do? Just share a couple of other articles.
I think they've got no choice but to defend Taiwan.
And to start making their own chips.
Mm.
So in I'll just show you this article here. This is a New York Times article. The tech Cold War's most complicated machine that's out of China's reach. So this is the Dutch company that makes the chip making tool. So this is your laser. It doesn't make the chip, it's just one of the components of this complex facility that makes the chips. And what President Biden did, this is 2021, is it told the Netherlands, you can't sell to China. So who's taken control? $150 million chip-making tool from a Dutch company has become a lever in the US-Chinese struggle. It also shows how entrenched the global supply chain is. President Biden and many lawmakers in Washington are worried these days about computer chips and China's ambitions with the foundational technology. But a massive machine sold by a Dutch company has emerged as a key lever for policymakers and illustrates how any country's hopes of building a completely self-sufficient supply chain in semiconductor technology are unrealistic. We won't, for time, go on to read that, but ASML's machine has effectively turned into a choke point in the supply chain for chips, which act as the brains of computers and other digital devices. The tool's 3-continent development and production, using expertise and parts from Japan, the United States, and Germany, is also a reminder of just how global that supply chain is, providing a reality check for any country that wants to leap ahead in semiconductors by itself. That includes not only China, but the United States, where Congress is debating plans to spend more than $50 billion to reduce reliance on foreign chip manufacturers. Many branches of the federal government, particularly the Pentagon, have been worried about the US dependence on Taiwan's leading chip manufacturer and the island's proximity to China. So, hence, what do we end up with?
It's a concern.
The Chips and Science Act. The Chips and Science Act is a US federal statute enacted by the 117th United States Congress. It has bipartisan support and signed into law by President Joe Biden on August 9, 2022. The act provides roughly $280 billion in new funding to boost domestic research and manufacturing of semiconductors in the United States. The act includes $39 billion in subsidies, et cetera, where all the money is going. Basically, it's subsidizing the building of these fabs in America, but it's just a subsidy. You know, a new fab is $18 billion. And then, you know, you've got to upkeep that. So there's a lot of money. This is just the beginning of a lot of money that's going to have to be spent. The Act does not have an official short title as a whole, but is divided into 3 divisions. Oh, wait a minute, that's not what I want to read. This is what I want to read. The Act includes $39 billion in subsidies for chip manufacturing in US soil, along with 25% investment tax credits for costs of manufacturing equipment, and $13 billion for semiconductor research and workforce training, with the primary aim of countering China. The Chips and Science Act combines 2 bipartisan bills. So just notice there's not much that they agree on, in Congress, but there is bipartisan support for this Chips and Science Act. Both sides realize the importance of making their own chips, or at least stopping the reliance on Taiwan. It will take years. Like, you just don't build these things overnight. These will take a decade to get up and running. So it's kind of a little bit late, but it's a start. And read a portion of this Atlantic article. Why Biden's block on chips to China is a big deal. So not only are they putting money into building their own fabs, what Biden has done is he has stopped the supply chain into China itself. The new US export controls on semiconductor technology will hurt Chinese industries. Xi Jinping has only himself to blame. As the Chinese Communist Party 20th Congress wrapped up at the weekend, its General Secretary and the country's President, Xi Jinping, emerged with his new leadership team, loyalists to a man, and with more commanding control over China than any political figure has held in the country for nearly half a century. Having shoved aside his political rivals, Xi can rule over the world's rising great power virtually uncontested. Yet, amid this display of pomp and power, President Joe Biden showed Xi who's boss. 2 days earlier, on October 21, Biden had dropped the hammer on China's semiconductor industry by fully implementing a slew of tough controls on the export of American chip technology to China. This is a painful blow to Xi's ambitions to rival the US, delivered at the very moment when the Chinese leader has reached the pinnacle of his political influence. Ouch. Even as Xi laid out his vision for the nation's great rejuvenation, indicating that he considers China's technological achievements central to it, Biden demonstrated that the US still possesses the fight and the bite to defend its primacy. Biden's new policy reveals that the standard narrative of China's unstoppable ascent and America's inexorable decline is based on flawed assumptions. The US continues to hold tremendous economic and technological advantages over China, which, as Biden just signaled, Washington is becoming more willing to use against its communist competitor. Above all, Biden's export control measures are a ruthless expression of American clout and an intentional reminder that in many respects, America has it and China does not. The technology analyst Gregory Allen, a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, wrote that Biden is exercising technological and geopolitical power on an incredible scale. So, who's the boss? Who's in control? One more paragraph. The curbs Washington has imposed involve the export of certain chips and manufacturing equipment to China, and in some cases to particular blacklisted Chinese companies. The goal is to impede China's efforts to develop the high-end semiconductors required for artificial intelligence and supercomputing. Though they target a narrow range of chip technologies, the controls are comprehensive. The regulations block Chinese firms that are trying to develop advanced chips from accessing non-Chinese factories that rely on US technology to manufacture their products, and deprive those firms of expertise by barring American citizens and companies from assisting them. Okay, so America has really taken control in this situation. It has barred companies. It said to the Netherlands, you can't sell to China anymore. Actually, the Netherlands has a backlog of countries that it's trying to make these machines for. So it's not feeling the pinch at the moment. But there are other countries, manufacturers across the world that are in those supply chains that America stepped in and said, no, not to China. And the world is going, okay. They're doing what the Biden administration is saying. So, you know, we talked about Gordon Moore's law, and the exponential growth of this technology. You can't get behind. Like China could never catch up. Never catch up. Russia, totally out of the game. All they can hope for, and that doesn't mean like China has or Russia has military equipment that can do a lot of damage. I can still blow up a dam, could possibly blow up a nuclear facility, but it doesn't have the high-end capabilities with the military equipment, and it won't have it with artificial intelligence. So that's the two things that America don't want Russia and China to have. Russia out of the game, China years behind. So remember 2014, it was the Made in China 2025 campaign. It's 2023. They'll never have it by 2025. What we do know is China's wanted Taiwan back before it ever had a fab on its soil. It's always wanted Taiwan back. So there's two schools of thought. One is the Taiwanese school of thought is what they call a silicon shield. That means they're never gonna attack us. They know how globally important we are. It would cost them and the world too much. So they feel protected by the fact that they do have these factories, that to stop that supply chain, to close down one of their factories would bring on not a recession, but a Great Depression right across the world. So there's that school of thought that they wouldn't do it. The other side is that you don't know what these authoritarian leaders will do because they make dumb decisions. History is full of wars that were economic disasters for both sides. War in Ukraine is a good example. And when these authoritarian leaders surround themselves with sycophants that tell them what they think they want to hear, then they could, you know, Xi has promised to return Taiwan to Chinese control. So it's high on his list of priorities. Remember, Ian Bremmer said it won't happen in 2023. It won't happen in 2023. Probably wouldn't happen in 2024 either. But what if there was a change of administration? What if there was a president that was just as hardcore nationalistic as the CCP and didn't care about the rest of the world and wasn't going to spend money to defend any other country, probably pull out of Ukraine? All you need is a Trump in office who admires Xi Jinping, thinks he's a great man and a good friend. There's a lot of inconsistencies there because he doesn't like losing trade to China, but they cut a deal that's in favor of both. So anything is on the agenda. So these studies aren't about making application, it's just filling in some details of why we're noting Taiwan at our major waymarks, why it is so strategically important today, and why we rely on these tiny weeny little chips and that they're really running the world and we don't really even give them a thought. So I think we're really running out of time. Is there any questions?
Comment. Sorry. Taiwan, it seems like Taiwan and Chinese relationship is very similar to Ukraine and Russia relationship. Control. The other two are getting out of hand because they're becoming more powerful. The chips is making Taiwan quite known in the world, and Ukraine is getting all this more modern equipment compared to Russia. That's just what I sort of saw. Is that?
Yeah. Similarities. Ukraine, breadbasket of the world, really needed. Taiwan is in a different area.
I had one very quick thought, Elder Terrie, on how China sees it as a wayward province and really wants to enforce reunification, and people and ah about whether or not the United States would get involved and whatnot. They've for years gone with a they called it strategic ambiguity, you know, will we or won't we sort of thing. But I think it's important to remember that Taiwan's defense force is made up of like tip of the spear US military hardware, F-16 fighters, a lot of those things, and that contains really important strategic, you know, classified information that the US would not be prepared to just let go to its biggest rival in a heartbeat. They're not just going to be like, oh yeah, have that, China.
They've been over there training the Taiwanese military since the Trump administration. So that Trump, that they didn't speak openly about it, but it's known now. The thing is, I mean, China would be watching the world's reaction to Russia-Ukraine war and how it all stepped in. So you'd think, oh, well, maybe that'd put it off. But it's also watched how Russia's saber rattling of nuclear weapons worked. You know, Russia said, oh, we'll use nuclear, and the world went, oh, you know, okay. And America, you know, NATO haven't fully engaged themselves in this war. They've supplied weapons. So you could envisage a scenario where first day of the war on Taiwan, and China threatens nuclear weapons, and what's the world going to do? So we used to talk about mutually assured destruction. Attacking Taiwan would be mutually assured economic destruction. So, you know, I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but that they're the things that weigh heavily on politicians across the world and military across the world at the moment.
And Terrie, I remember that
Yes.
Biden was asked whether he will defend Taiwan militarily, and he said yes. He declared that he will do that.
Yes. Yes.
You know,
very clearly. What's
very
the next
clear.
president going to do? That's the question.
Yeah.
So I'll just share one more article and then I'll close. This is from the Washington Post. Sanctions forcing Russia to use appliance parts in military gear. With Western technology sales banned, Russia is using computer chips meant for household appliances in battlefield gear, Commerce Secretary tells a Senate hearing. So US-led sanctions are forcing Russia to use computer chips from dishwashers and refrigerators in some military equipment. So that's what they're finding in the in the aftermath of some of the war zones. And just see if there's anything else. If I've missed it, I'll bring it up next time. So I might just close it there. Yes?
Excuse me, Elder Terrie, I'm just wondering, is the rest of, well, not the rest of the world, but are these countries listening to what the USA says because of how they've seen Biden step in over Ukraine and Russia? Or is there more to it than that behind the scenes?
I just think they're recognising, I mean, the Netherlands is a democratic country. Is it NATO? The Netherlands? I'm not sure. But they know who they want to listen to. They might not be really happy with the decision. They would like China's money as well. There's a market. So that's the problem the world got into in 2001 with them entering the World Trade Organization. Is a lot of countries and companies have made huge money and profits in entering China. And now they're decoupling, as Ian Bremmer put it. And then, you know, there's a loss at decoupling, but there's also a loss at not decoupling, but it won't be monetary.
And do you think this is sort of almost like Acts 27, where or Pyrrhus, sorry, where Europe starts to take ambassadors up to acknowledge the King of the North, even though we know that that is the papacy? Is this sort of the rise of that, where the other nations are giving their what's it called? You know, they're giving their will over to the King of the North, which at the moment it's just the armies.
So I'm not making application, but I think we can all see that America's will is being obeyed.
Yeah.
They're listening and they're heeding.
Yeah.
I know the technology is different, difficult. Of course it is. It's very, it's mind-boggling, absolutely mind-boggling. But just to get it, just to even know that it's mind-boggling is enough. We don't need to understand it. We just need to know that look, we're Zooming in front of computers with our phones, and it's we're surrounded by this technology. We don't have to understand how it works to use it, but I think we do need to understand how important it is in the world economy and how the world will break down if the supply chains that run it are interfered with. Hence AUKUS and opening the trade routes of the South China Sea, etc. You know. So anyway, I will stop. Let's close with prayer.
So bitter.
A loving God in heaven, we thank you that you have made things simple for us. We have the lines that take complex histories and show us where we are and where we are going. But we are surrounded with complexity. Help us to wade through the mud and see what is important and recognize current events and how they are affecting us. So I pray for the next study. May you bless the presenter and the rest of our morning and guide and direct us as we read and watch what is happening in the world. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.